Okay, so chapter 15 in your book starts on page 187. This is going to feel really redundant because I already went over ethical principles in research in your last class, but we're just gonna briefly talk about it again. Okay, so learning the objectives for this chapter will be to describe the evolution of ethics in research, define common ethical principle terminologies, describe the role of ethics in research, identify the role of the government and private entities in research. So after this chapter, you should be able to apply a professional code of ethics in all endeavors. Adhere to state and federal laws, recommendations, and regulations in the provision of oral health care, and use critical thinking skills and comprehensive problem solving to identify oral health care strategies that promote patient health and wellness. Assume responsibility for professional actions and care based on accepted scientific theories, research, and the accepted standard of care. Continuously perform self assessment for lifelong learning and professional growth, and integrate accepted scientific theories and research into educational, preventive, and therapeutic oral health services. All right, so what are we doing this for? Bioethics is very important. It has an inherent role in healthcare. Ethics should guide us in our behaviors between morally acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And this chapter briefly touches on some of those concepts. Okay, so the Hippocratic Oath came about in 400 BC. Hippocrates is known as by many as the individual who helped create the distinct profession of medicine. He's sometimes known as the father of medicine. He wasn't just a doctor, but he is well known for those types of things. And so he comes up with the Hippocratic Oath. And so I've actually pulled out the Hippocratic Oath. We were gonna, the slide wanted me to let you read every single one. This is on page 188 in your book. This is box 15-1. And we'll just talk about each of the things that the Hippocratic Oath kind of has in it. You have to keep in mind that this was in 400 BC, and so the world is a very different place at this time. But it just basically gives moral constructs and ethical standards. It has the concept that there has to be an ethical standard in the way that we practice medicine. So for the Hippocratic Oath, it's to hold him who taught me this art equally dear to me as my parents, to be a partner in life with him and to fulfill his needs when required, to look upon his offspring as equals to my own siblings and to teach them this art if they shall wish to learn it without fee or contract, and that by the set rules, lectures, and every other mode of instruction, I will impart a knowledge of the art to my own sons and those of my teachers, and to students bound by this contract and having sworn this oath to the law of medicine, but to no others. This is basically that when people wanted to learn medicine from Hippocrates, they would go to him and he would teach them, and he would basically accept them into his family, and they would be bonded and they would learn medicine from him. This next one is I will use those dietary regimens which benefit my patients according to the greatest ability and judgment, and I will do no harm or injustice to them. So the whole first do no harm is where that comes from. The only part that I really love about the Hippocratic Oath is that he establishes that food should be thy medicine. He goes, I will not give a lethal drug to anyone if I am asked, nor will I advise such a plan. And similarly, I will not give a woman a pessary to cause an abortion. Got to think about the time that this was written. In purity and according to divine law, will I carry out my life and my art. I will not use the knife, even upon those suffering from stones, but I will leave this to those who are trained in this craft. Into whatever homes I go, I will enter them for the benefit of the sick, avoiding any voluntary act of impropriety or corruption, including the seduction of women or men, whether they are free men or slaves. Again, think about the time. Whatever I see or hear in the lives of my patients, whether in connection with my professional practice or not, which ought not to be spoken of outside, I will keep secret, as considering all things to be private. All such things. This is, basically the beginning of HIPAA. And then, so long as I maintain this oath faithfully and without corruption, may it be granted to me to partake of life fully and the practice of my art, gaining the respect of all men for all time. However, should I transgress this oath and violate it, may the opposite be my fate. Basically, that doctors should be held as, individuals who dedicate their lives to doing good. And if they don't dedicate their lives to doing good, then they shouldn't be doctors. So these are the terms that we go over in ethical practice. First is non-maleficence. It means to not harm any of your patients. Don't do anything that could cause harm. Beneficence means removing existing harm or anything that would, you're going to remove things that hurt them, but basically you're going to do things that are good for them. Autonomy is the ability to govern one's profession and respect for others. Autonomy is the respect that you give others that they make their own decisions. And then paternalism is doing what the provider thinks is right. A lot of people kind of separate these two as juxtapose. But there are certain aspects of paternalism that should still be incorporated. The fact that you went to dental hygiene school and you have the ability to recommend certain patient or certain treatments. If you're saying the patient needs SCRP, the patient has the autonomy to say, no, I want a prophy, but your paternalism needs to step in and say, I cannot give you a prophy because you need an SCRP. Justice is where you provide patients what is owed. Don't cheat them out of things. Just do right by them. If you say you're going to provide a service, provide it. And then you treat them fairly, basically. And then veracity is just being honest with them. So if they ask, do they need that $200 toothbrush, then, just be honest with that. We talked about the Nuremberg Code in the ethics part of last term, but the Nuremberg Code is developed after World War II because of the treatment that Nazi Germany was conducting studies on Jewish concentration camp people. And so they did terrible, terrible things to them, which we talked about last term. That video is still up on YouTube. If you are interested to go back and watch it again, you can. But basically, they did terrible things, and after the war, they saw all the terrible things that had happened to the Jewish, and so they came up with a code that you have to follow when you do studies or research studies. And so if you look on page 189 in box 15-2, it goes over those 11 Nuremberg Code principles. Keeping with that sort of evolution of the ethics in research, we come to the United States chapter of unethical practice, which happens from 1932 to 1972, which was the Tuskegee study, which studied how syphilis affects Black men in rural Alabama. And what came of that, of course, was the Belmont report. It moves into AIDS though, because of what happened in the Tuskegee study. The FDA has a lot of very particular sort of processes to go about conducting a study and approving new medications. And because of that, when the AIDS epidemic happened in the 80s, they started looking at these medications in order to help people who were suffering from AIDS, but they were dying faster than the research studies could help them. And so there were activists in the 1990s who were petitioning Congress. They're basically going to Congress and saying that the process to get a drug approved was too long and that people were dying because of it, and that without taking these experimental medications, that people were going to die anyway. So that people were willing to take some risk in order to avoid certain death. And so that's really where the FDA actually creates like this fast track approval for certain drug companies. Then fast forward to Ebola. Your book is funny because it says, more recently, the Ebola outbreak in Africa, which reiterated the need for safe and effective research protocols to reduce the chance of communicable disease pandemic. And then, of course, today we have COVID, which there you see firsthand how vaccines are created, and this was actually the fastest that a vaccine has been created and rolled out. And so, I think that some of the side effects we're seeing is partly in due to how much wasn't studied. The in fast tracking the vaccine, it means that we're taking a little bit more risk, but we have to outweigh the risk versus the reward here of having a herd immunity to COVID. So it's pretty interesting to live. We're reading historical perspectives, but we're right smack dab in the middle of history. So ethics, in a nutshell, is just about doing the right thing. Your book talks about ethical behavior in research needs to be described as what is right and legal and fair. And so sometimes it's hard to find something that is right, legal, and fair, right? That's those three don't always go hand in hand, right? Because what is right isn't always legal, and what is right and legal isn't always fair, and vice versa on all of that. And so it's not always obvious what the right option that's legal and fair, and so that can sometimes put us into ethical dilemmas, and it's important that we evaluate those ethical dilemmas and we recognize that they exist so that we are actively trying to do the right thing. So large institutions will often have their own code of ethics. This includes the FDA, and there are other administrations like the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Institutes of Health, and all of the major universities have their own code of ethics. And typically they're even more stringent than the Nuremberg Code and the Belmont Report. So while, they have guidelines for ethical practice in research. Each institution and large like institution like universities, but also institutions like the FDA, have their own sort of regulations that are even more, well, in their opinions, ethical, right? And so each institution, when they are conducting medical research, have to be monitored by an institutional review board or IRB. So, an institutional review board is an organization that is tasked with reviewing the ethical implications of a research study anytime there are human beings involved. It assures that the rights and the safety of the research subjects are respected and protected. That's what it has to do first. And then, second, it has to protect the institution against lawsuits that against lawsuits and help to ensure that the research results will not be flawed because the study was ethically unsound. So basically, the institutional review board has two jobs. One is to protect research subjects and make sure that they're being treated correctly. But then, in the same token, in making sure that the people are treated properly, it protects the institution from lawsuits, because if we're treating people badly, then they sue, right? And so if the IRB is properly taking care of the people and making sure that the research study is being conducted appropriately, then it's then covering the institutions behind in that they won't be sued, and all of that. So the ethical issues of research, after the Tuskegee study, we know that the Belmont report came out describing those ethical principles. And the Belmont report has those three principles, which we talk about in the other lecture. But those three principles are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And they're very important to conducting research. Okay, so our ethical considerations for the institution wants to prevent research misconduct. We talk about ethical misconduct in the other PowerPoint in the other lecture. So if you are unaware of what each of one of these are, please go see that other lecture. But the research misconduct includes plagiarism, copyright or patent infringement, falsifying or fabricating data, misrepresenting data, and conflicts of interest. Um, the institution wants to ensure that the human study subjects' participation is voluntary. There can be no coercion or any type of pushing the study subject to participate, and then that the participants have to be free to withdraw at any time for any reason. They're there on their own volition, and they are allowed to leave at their own volition as well. So then, of course, when we talk about their participation being voluntary, that leads us to informed consent. And informed consent is what we have to get from our participants in order to be able to collect data from them, right? In order to let them participate. So the informed consent requires that a subject in a research study be educated about the study's purpose, duration, experimental procedures, alternatives, risks, and benefits. This means that when our patient sits down or our participant sits down, we have to tell them all of the information about what we're doing, why we're doing it, what we're looking for, all of those kinds of things. Unless knowing what we're looking for is going to somehow skew our data, then we don't tell them that necessarily. We have to give them all of the information that they need in order to be able to make the decision. And so if you think about it as the researcher, would you volunteer for this study if you knew X, Y, and Z? You have to tell them all of X, Y, and Z. So it's a process. It's not just a piece of paper, right? We have to give them all of that information, and we have to give them that information in it says in a language that they understand, right? But in a form that they understand. We have to break it down for them because a lot of times our informed consent is written at the researcher level, the expert level, and our patients aren't experts in whatever the field of study is or the discipline, right? And so we have to tell them what it is, and we have to make them understand what we're talking about. So the information is presented to the subjects, they have to understand it, and then it should be revised whenever necessary. So if, part of the way through we're actually like, hey, we need to add a clause to this research study, we need to tell our patients what we're changing, and we need to change it when we need to. So there is the one exception to having to obtain informed consent, and I guess HAT is when we're using surveys or questionnaires. So if the information that they give us has absolutely no personal information on it, right? Then we don't have to use informed consent. When a patient takes a survey, there should be like a little thing at the beginning saying, that um, you doing this is informed consent, that you are willing to give us this data. You don't give us any data that we would then collect. We're not collecting any personal information, right? So if the participant is not English speaking, is a minor, isn't competent, right, isn't able to give consent, then informed consent becomes extremely important ethical component. We've talked about that before too, where the people who aren't able to give their own consent are they're a vulnerable population, and so we need to protect them as much as we possibly can and make sure that not only are they volunteering, but also that whoever is able to give us consent isn't coercing them, and whoever it is giving the consent. And then research subjects must not be identified. And so this talks about the exception being that if you use photographs in an article, um, then you're able to, like, the patients or the study subjects would have given consent to be able to use their photograph, which of course a photograph would make the patient identifiable. But anytime you collect data on a person, before you then publish that data, you have to completely scrub all of the personal information off of that. And in not protecting your patient's personal information, is a very egregious error on the fact of the researcher. This is also something that we talk about when we're collecting data. You have to protect whatever your collection, vessel is. If you're using a recorder or you're using a computer in order to store that information, like on a laptop, and then you lose your laptop or it gets stolen, you've now released potentially, however many study subjects information out there. And so it's important that you have those safety precautions in place in order to protect that information. The same way we protect our patients' information is the same way we have to protect our research participants. Which of course leads us to HIPAA, right? Because HIPAA is it almost looked like it was spelled wrong because the A was down here. It kind of tripped me out a little minute. But the HIPAA Act is where things become really important as far as protecting the health information of our patients, and we're not allowed to share that information with anyone without the patient's consent. So when we talk about how research subjects volunteer for studies, right? Then we run into people who volunteer for more than one study, right? Because there is often compensation for their time when they volunteer. We have to look at people who are volunteering for multiple studies or one right after the other in order to make money as a research volunteer. This start is on page 192 in your book. And so this looks at the ethical dilemma that is involved when we pay subjects as a way to make a living because we try not to harm them, right? That's our main goal. But we also have that we need those subjects who volunteer for this kind of thing. And we need people to volunteer, so we get the kinds of people who volunteer, right? That's just kind of a caveat of this. And so we would have to theorize that repeated use of numerous study drugs would probably create side effects that would not necessarily be a part of the average person or the population when they take the medication. And so this is something that exists in research that we really don't really talk about very often, but we have to wonder how valid is our research if we are using sort of those repeat study subjects. Okay, so the research roles of government and private entities. Um, it the federal government has always been kind of center to medical research. It has a dual role in both promoting research while protecting the public, right? And so the government primarily gets involved in setting the standards for conducting those research and for, publishing things like the Belmont Report and the Nuremberg Code, right? And so government entities like the FDA review research that's conducted in the private sector as well as research that's conducted, in the government way. And they have something called government oversight. And that government oversight is what provides those strict controls on what treatments, medicines, and medical devices that can be sold and on what health claims can be made regarding those products. Those are the reasons that we can say a toothpaste that has a certain amount of abrasivity to it is able to be marketed as whitening, whereas other toothpastes that don't have that can't be marked whitening. So the FDA and that government oversight that they have is how each company is able to they set the rules that the company is then able to study and promote and sell and market different products, right? And we've talked about that before. And then the National Institute of Health is where the federal government also comes in and conducts research. And now, because the National Institute of Health is conducting research with taxpayer money, all of the research findings then have to be published free of charge to the public because essentially they paid for it, right? And so that's when you go to PubMed and it has PubMed Central, which is where all of the studies that have ever been conducted by the NIH are available to you to read for free. And then local governments come in as like the public health departments, and they serve either as research centers for the government research, like the NIH might be running, a study based on, a certain demographic of people. And so they'll go to the local public health department of the area where there are a lot of people that live there that fall into that demographic, and they'll go there to run their study, like people who have diabetes, right? And then in addition, local governments also benefit from that grant money or from medical equipment resulting from the research study. So sometimes, they'll be studying, type 2 diabetes, and in doing so, they're providing services to that local area for type 2 diabetes while they study it, right? Um, Private institutions is where the bulk of medical research happens. This is because of companies. So companies want to create products and sell those products. And so in order to do so, they have to have research on it. There has to be a study showing efficacy and all of that, right? And they don't necessarily want to wait around for the federal government to grant them a grant, right? Because there's a lot of competition for grants and it's really hard to get one. And so they privately fund their own research studies so that they can have a study that shows whether or not their drug or their product is effective, right? And so um, they end up funding their own research, and it typically ends up happening faster when they fund it themselves and more cost effective because they don't have to fund all of those other people who grant grants, right? And so funding for research can come from federal government grants, or it also can come from the institution itself, or from private companies, or through philanthropy. Philanthropy is a little bit different, like people who are just taking an interest kind of thing. Competition for grant money is great, like we talked about. And you would think that the hope is that because it is so competitive to get a grant, that the types of research that are being conducted under grants are better. They're better studies. They're more needed, right? But that is not always true. And then the large institutions can actually contribute multiple perspectives on a single topic. So this is talking about where there might be two dental schools that are in different areas of the country, and they both conduct the same study, but they have different populations because they only have access to the people around them. And so in doing that, you get not only reproducibility and therefore reliability, but you get different perspectives. You might get a totally different outcome because you're studying a different population of people. Um, and then it also goes into the research conducted by private companies also has negative effects, right? And we've talked about that. There's an inherent bias that goes into those types of things. And so some researchers, in an effort to conduct studies more quickly and less expensively, turn to developing countries to find participants. And these researchers may pay a private institutional review board to approve their study, and because they're being paid by the people who are going to conduct the study, they probably approve things that they wouldn't normally approve if they weren't being paid to do so. And so um, the only way to do research isn't just through a university. It's not only through a research center. There's many different avenues that you can take. All right, so every hygienist, whether or not they're directly involved in research, whether they're conducting it themselves, they should be aware of those ethical principles and the guidelines and the practices of conducting ethical research, because and when we're reviewing research, or we're looking at different research studies, we need to be able to critically analyze those bioethics, right? We need to be able to determine, were these research participants treated fairly? And if they weren't, then that may have skewed our data. It may change the way we feel about either that product or that treatment or that study in general. And so it's important that you're aware of how the researchers were supposed to conduct themselves so that you're able to determine whether or not they did.